The Speedy World. I am Sayed Shabahat Ali, and you're watching Fault Lines. The diplomatic relationship between Iran and Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is bad for last several centuries. This does not date back to a few decades, but both the countries have a history of animosity and rivalry to an extent that it has never been thought on a serious level to bring this animosity down. To add into the crisis, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was pursuing a very aggressive foreign policy for last several years, because of which its relationship with Qatar and Turkey also got affected, whereas Iran had closed the embassy of Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 2016 and vice versa. But since then, there has been a lot of changes in the geopolitical order. After Xi Jinping securing his third term, there were several international initiatives that he launched on day one, and one of these initiatives was an agreement between Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran to resume their diplomatic relationship. China plays a very important role in this region. It has signed recently an agreement of $30 billion of investment in Saudi Arabia and $450 billion of trade and investment with Iran. This makes China one of the strongest players in the region. Not only that, but by bringing this agreement on ground, China has also once again endorsed its footmark as a major player in the political order of Middle East. Team Fault Lines have prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
Geopolitical tensions have been spiraling over the past several months between great powers. China's efforts in brokering a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia depict broader signs of a changing global order. During talks in Beijing, Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed to re-establish diplomatic relations and reopen their embassies within 2 months. The agreement also stipulated affirming the respect for the sovereignty of states and the non-interference in internal affairs of states. The trilateral statement also significantly mentioned the 2001 security arrangement and the broader 1998 cooperation agreement that Iran and Saudi Arabia had reached. Those agreements entailed a lot of economic, security, political cooperation, and high-level diplomatic contact. The agreement has potentially wide implications for Middle East, which is gripped by multiple politico-economic and security challenges. Better diplomatic linkages between Saudi Arabia and Iran will reduce the likelihood for regional conflict and will reduce regional tensions. China's role as a mediator in resolving long-standing issues between the regional powers heralds new era of multilateral world order. Saudi-Iran deal is an indication of new Middle East, where states are acting more independently of global powers. Resumption of normal relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia provides great capacities to the two countries, the region, and the Islamic world.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we actually start talking about the problem between Saudi Arabia and Iran and its history, it's very important to understand that the trade, and importantly the oil trade of Middle East, has started drifting away from the influence of US dollar. Not only China has decided to buy oil from Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in currencies other than US dollar, but also India is considering to purchase all the oil in different currencies other than US dollar. To talk about this matter and to see how economically these things are interconnected with the developments on the geopolitical front, I have invited a famous and reputable economist from Istanbul, Dr. Bilal Begis, is my guest and is joining me from Istanbul on Skype. Dr. Bilal, I welcome you to my show.
Thank you. Thank you, Syed.
Dr. Bilal, first things first. So, what is the history of dollar being used as an international currency? Because I'm sure most of the viewers of this program have been seeing dollar being used as an international currency ever since they remember international trade being conducted.
So, dollar, as we all know, it's the current global reserve currency, and it's used predominantly used for energy trade, for international financial transactions, and it has gained that role since at least the 1940s. So we're talking about the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, and dollar basically replaced gold and other currencies that were used before that. So the new world order of post Second World War, it came with these international economic and financial adjustment, a new system. And dollar was basically at the center of, at the heart of this new design, new economic and financial design. And so up until 1970s, we had that fixed exchange rate regime, the Bretton Woods system, and dollar was basically the main currency, the main unit of account. Everything was basically convertible to US dollar, and US dollar was backed by the gold reserves that the US had. But starting with 1970s, it was actually the US itself that decided to end that Bretton Woods system and dollar's convertibility to the gold. But ever since, even after 1970s, even after that Bretton Woods system it was demolished, the US dollar, it remained the global reserve currency. And even nowadays, about 60 to 70% of all international trade or international financial transactions, they are still done in terms of the US dollar. And it's the main currency, the main unit of account that is used by all businesses, all financial institutions to do business with the other counterparts in all around the world. But of course, we have.
But Dr. Bilal, did the West, particularly the European nations, which were on the pinnacle of their power during the Second World War, allow USD to become the global currency with all this comfort? Didn't they think for a while that their strong economies can also come forward and take lead in the global trade?
So, US, the American economy, it was about 40 to 50% of the whole world GDP at that time. We're talking about 1940s, the post Second World War era. And basically, almost all of the world economy was devastated except the US. So the US economy was doing pretty good actually at that time. And they also had huge gold reserves. And that was actually the main reason US dollar was accepted as a new replacement for the gold instrument that was used up until the Second World War. So the huge gold reserves and relatively big and large American economy, they helped with this new process and the US dollar being accepted as the new global reserve currency.
And as you referred to 1970s, Dr. Bilal, is this the trade of oil being done in US dollar that was one of the most important steps making dollar a far more stronger international currency?
Exactly, yeah. So America's relations with the oil exporting countries and their bargaining power, it basically helped the US dollar remaining as the global reserve currency, and it was not convertible to the gold anymore. But that didn't matter because all people cared about was whether they were able to buy oil or gas recently with the American dollars that they had in hand in their pockets, in their accounts. So as far as you could use US dollar to buy or to import the energy, that's all that mattered. And US dollar was still used as the reserve currency for that type of transactions. But of course, we had some challenge in 1960s. The French politicians, they were against US dollar being used as the global reserve currency. And they had this idea that the US dollar had this exorbitant privilege at that time. And also during the global financial crisis of 2008, there was also a lot of criticism again from the emerging world economies such as Brazil and many other BRICS economies, other newly emerging developing economies. They were also against these exorbitant privilege that the countries such as U.S. had in terms of being able to print that reserve currency at almost no cost, and in a way getting these zero interest loans for unlimited amounts.
And just to add into it, Dr. Bilal, does that mean that the international trade being done in USDs is one of the strongest financial leverages that United States enjoys in the global financial order?
That is true. Yeah, absolutely. And that is the main financial instrument, an economic instrument that the U.S. is using to remain the main superpower of the world economy, the financial system, as well as being a military and political superpower. So that is mainly coming from the fact that US dollar is still used for almost all transactions all around the world.
Now, Dr. Bilal, let's talk about the subject that has actually that actually is the point of discussion of this program, the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. How do you think this is going to affect the global oil trade going forward?
Well, it is certainly a very critical development, and it will affect the world political spectrum as well as the economic and financial system. It will affect the whole world economy looking forward. And it is a good sign that China is emerging as a new mediator in many international economic and political disputes, while the U.S. is still currently busy with the war going on in Ukraine and political events that are going on in the Pacific region. And in the meantime, China is emerging as a new political and economic power, as we see from this deal in Middle East. So this new deal and the peace process, it will, in the meantime, it will be a mutually beneficial deal or peace process for both sides. And it's a new strategic move, actually. So China needs the Middle Eastern energy for such a big economy with a really high growth rates. And it also needs new allies for its Belt and Road Initiative, a dream project for Xi Jinping. As we know, his third term has already started. So for the trade projects, future trade projects, and for the energy needs of China, this type of new arrangements, new peace processes, new deals, they are very, very critical. And also it's beneficial, it's to the benefit of the Middle Eastern or the energy-rich Middle Eastern countries, because they also need new markets for their energy exports, and they also need new markets for their petrodollars to invest or even to just park there.
But Dr. Bilal, what can be the implications for many other economies that are not directly part of this deal? Do you believe it's going to have some effect or some impact on these economies that are not directly a part of the trade that is happening at the moment?
Well, it is one of the events that could likely decrease the dominance of US dollar, and countries such as Saudi Arabia, as we have recently heard, they started using, for example, the Chinese renminbi for the energy trade. So that is one of the reasons probably the Americans, the US should worry about. So dollar's reserve currency role, it could be weakened a little bit. And also countries such as Iran that are currently sanctioned by the US, they are also gaining new allies and new rooms for maneuver. And Saudi Arabia, they also have one of the largest oil reserves, but they will also need new markets looking forward. They are predominantly dependent upon the U.S. for energy export and also for any type of financial activities, and they are also gaining new allies. So it could potentially, looking forward, it could empower China, increase their role in international economic and financial system, and in the meantime decrease the role and the power of American soft power or financial power or economic power. So that's also a possibility.
And Dr. Bilal, also I would want to invite your comments on the trends of global recession. Now, we have read this over several times in multiple international newspapers that the global recession has started showing off its signs. Do you agree with this statement?
There are a lot of factors, a lot of signs that lead to that conclusion that the world economy could be moving into a new recession. So recently, 1 or 2 days ago, Goldman Sachs had such a forecast. They shared a new note saying that they expect a new American recession with a 35%. And earlier that was just a 25% event that was expected. So these type of new incidents or the new events, they are showing that the world economy or the dominance of Asia and China in the world economy, in the world financial system, it is increasing, and they are replacing in a way the Western economies, the Western financial power, including the US and Europe. So China and Asia, they are currently rising, and their influence in international economic system, in financial system, in international trade is increasing, as well as their bargaining power in energy deals, in financial transactions, they are also increasing. And that could actually, the fact that China and Asia, they are rising, they could replace or they could make up for these growth declines in the West, in the US and Europe. And they could be an opportunity to deal with a potential upcoming recession in the Western world. But for the moment, it seems like a recession is very, very likely in the US and Europe. And we are moving toward that era. But in the meantime, we also have this fact that we have really high growth rates in Asia, in China, in BRIC economies in general, including Brazil, South Africa, China, India, and many other newly emerging developing economies such as Pakistan, Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia. And we'll see how fast or how quickly these type of countries, they will be able to compensate for the growth declines in the Western world.
So in that case, what is really behind the fall of the international banks, particularly in the United States? The fall of Silicon Valley Bank has created at least a lot of buzz in the global media, if not the financial markets at large.
Well, these bank failures, in their nature, they are not exactly the same type of crisis as the 2008 crisis. But it's still, again, it is a banking crisis, and it's not just the Silicon Valley Bank or the American banks. We have almost similar type of issues with the European banks. Well, indeed, when the Fed or the European Central Bank, even the Bank of England, when they started this new monetary tightening or interest rate increase cycle, we were actually expecting some type of distress in the financial markets, in many financial institutions, but we were not sure when that will take place. So for, in particular, the Silicon Valley Bank, we have the solvency issue due to the excessive long-term low-rate bond holdings, including the treasuries and the mortgage-backed securities. And we have resulting unrealized losses, not just for these banks, but for the American banking system as a whole. For example, there was a data shared by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation showing that the American banking system's exposure to this interest rate risk, it was as high as 620 billion US dollar. And for most of these banks, there is no hedging against these rising interest rate risks. For example, they have no insurance, as in the interest rate swaps for the changing interest rates. And part of it is also the moral hazard related to these banks, these financial institutions' risk management, their top management's involvement in supervision of their own banks, and this has something to do with the Federal Reserve System. And we had the resulting run on banks, run on deposits, which really worsened the situation. And there was also short selling on stocks, and it seems like especially those short sellers, they actually gained big time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bilal, for being guest in our program today.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with second segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen, since we are talking about Iran and Saudi Arabia coming forward, which we believe is one of the major initiatives taking place under Xi Jinping's rule in China, perhaps one of the largest diplomatic leaps that China has taken, I've invited Usama Rizvi, who is an expert on the subject and is going to connect the economics and the geopolitics behind this development. Usama, I welcome you to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Usama, कैसे Kingdom of Saudi Arabia shaking hand with Iran? Is that really such a big development? How do you see this?
So first of all, speaking from a bigger picture perspective, I believe this is very important given the post-pandemic world that we have sort of started to see. We need to understand that this happened just after the third term of the President Xi started. This happened on their other important anniversaries. And this is something that President Biden or others before him have been working to pull off from quite a while. And that China has been able to do it, and it has been termed as a diplomatic coup by many. This speaks to the growing diplomatic prowess of China as well. So before that, most of the people, most of the observers, they tend to think that China's growth or China's influence lies in its economic power. But this shows that that isn't true. China is also becoming more stronger in terms of diplomacy. Now this entails a lot of other changes, and of course we'll talk about that. But from a bigger picture perspective, I think this shows that in the Eastern Hemisphere, China has started to take a more leading role. China has started to come into the front in terms of global leadership, at least in this part of the world, something that it wasn't doing before.
And why would KSA joining hand with Iran be such a top priority for China? What does China take in it? I mean, is that really something symbolic in nature, or does it actually benefit China in some way?
That's a very interesting question. Actually, we need to realize that China China is one of the largest consumers of oil. China is one of the largest consumers of soybean, of copper, and other commodities. So it shows, and the recent Russia-Ukrainian war and the vulnerability of the global supply chains have triggered this change, not amongst China, but amongst all the other nations across the world, that they need to prioritize their energy, their food, and so to speak, their economic security. And when you look at this development from this angle, this perspective, it makes sense. If Iran and Saudi Arabia, they join hands, or if they sort of form some sort of peace in the region, that would ensure smooth flows of oil, that would ensure smooth flows of energy, that can ensure more a sort of cooperation between Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. That can also, we need to realize Saudi Arabia is the key ally of US. So they are also looking at from that angle. They're trying to just chip away at the countries that are closer to the United States. If it results into long-term gas, oil contracts, naturally and obviously Saudi Arabia would get into some sort of conflict with the US. They'll need to decide what to do. So there's a lot of moving pieces. But for China, this is like they have tapped into a vacuum that was left there because of, I would say, inept and confrontational foreign policy by the recent administrations of the United States of America.
But will you agree with me if I say that based on several other initiatives that Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has taken so far, it's clearly drifting away from the American bloc. It perhaps is in a trajectory which is opposite to what the United States desires. Would you agree with me on this?
I don't think there is such a drastic tilt to this, but of course, as I said in the previous, as I said previously, recently, that we need to realize that China is also trying to work on the diplomatic dimension, to sort of make itself to be recognized as an international leader, and that it will do in stages, in certain phases. Of course, it does not want to direct some sort of sanctions or some sort of penalties, any sort of penal outcome by doing it in a very blatant manner. So that's there, but I don't think that there is this dimension to this, as I just mentioned. It's not as drastic. To be honest, we even do not know that this so-called deal will hold out. There are multiple reasons for that. So it's far-fetched. It's a far-fetched thought right now. So this is just sort of educated conjecturing or surmising or guess.
Osama, as you have mentioned Iran's economic problem, I would want to remind you that in JCPOA, China is one of the members. And whatever concerns Iran has toward JCPOA, certainly a part of it goes to China as well. So don't you believe there are too many slips between the cup and the lips?
There are indeed, actually, and in fact, you gave a very good point. But until this February, the percentage of uranium enrichment has touched 84%, which is not something that the IAEA and other Western countries endorses. So that has the potential to derail all of this. But that said, how I am seeing this is that China is bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia into its loop. And once it is done, maybe China is thinking that once it is done, I can sort of nudge Iran to become more compliant to the Western sanctions. I can nudge Iran into more friendly sort of cooperation in terms of businesses and other economic agreements that might sort of, converts or it inclines Iran to move towards cooperation rather than confrontation. So it's China is trying to first of all bring Iran into its loop, Saudi Arabia into its loop, gain their trust, and then sort of say, okay, look, here, this is where we stand, and this is where we need to go. So within that, while doing it, they would of course get all these economic benefits that I was speaking about. That said, it isn't very easy. I'm saying it again. We don't know whether the deal will hold or not. But I look at from this angle that China is first of all trying to win their trust, trying to get into their into the room, bring them to the negotiation table. That is this. What does this deal do?
And how long do you believe, Osama, this agreement is going to last? Because both of these nations are involved, both of these states are involved against each other on various thematic fronts. So do you think all of this fire is going to be extinguished in a blink of an eye?
So you see, there are lots of, as you've said, there are lots of parties or stakeholders to this deal, both from the Iranian side, from the Saudi Arabian side, and also from the Chinese side. So moving forward, you can't give a timeline, but moving forward, it would be imperative, it would be mandatory for Chinese and for this deal to go on only when they include all the stakeholders. So this will include parties from Yemen. This would include parties from Syria. This would include parties from the hardliners of part of the Iranian regime. This would include the hardliners from Saudi Arabia and vice versa. So, and how do you track the progress of this deal, or how can you gauge whether this will be a successful deal or not? You can look at the proxies that is happening, in different parts of the world. Not to name any specific one. If you see a ceasefire, if you see stalks of a ceasefire, if you see some sort of some sort of appeasement in those, then behind closed doors we can see that people are serious. If we do not, if the business is as usual, if the proxies go on or rather intensifies, then we can be fairly sure that this would hold on.
Osama, don't you really think that it's business that is actually dictating the geopolitics, particularly in case of Iran, that is starving to be part of some lobby which allows it to trade openly? It's one of the most sanctioned countries in the world at the moment.
Um, Partially, yes. Energy continues to be a huge input for the Chinese government and the Chinese economy. I've shared that China consumes about half of the world's oil demand, and in fact, by 2050, most of the oil demand is going to come from India and China. Even in this year, China is going to be responsible for almost 60% of the oil demand overall across the world. So naturally, energy forms a big picture of it, but it isn't confined to energy. You see, China is also the largest consumer of soybeans, the feed for they feed to to get their meat, for their other sort of proteins. So that also comes there. There can be other agreements as well. One thing that I'm thinking is that because of the sanctions, because of all this post-Ukrainian war, international law changes going on, one thing that can serve as a hindrance in this cooperation is Iranian, the country Iran getting very close to Russia. There has been accusations to Iran that they have provided drones and other lethal support to Russia, and China, as I've said, they don't want a confrontation with the US. So that will keep this cooperation in check. And as I continue to highlight, and you as well, that there remains a lot of sort of not unpredictable aspects of this deal. But yeah, so it's not only going to be energy; they're going to be other facets of it as well.
So what I can gather from your conversation is that you believe United States and policies related to United States to sit at the heart of China's foreign policy.
Yes, and this it is only because of this that I say this, because you see, there is a in the background there is a full-on all-out chip war on semiconductors happening. 2 or 3 weeks ago, about 24 companies were blacklisted once again and added to the U.S. entity list. That forbids those companies to deal with China. U.S. has also sort of reprimanded Pakistan and other countries that has been getting help from China in terms of these semiconductors or materials that are sensitive or can be used in military. There is also a war of words going on. There is also that spy balloon saga recently. And for a country like China, who is trying to go this way, it wouldn't make sense for China to enter into a confrontational mode, specifically right now when they are sort of building more connections. The world is opening up. Chinese economy itself faced a lot of issues recently, and it was only 2 months ago that they finally opened up and they're getting back on track. So amidst all this, if I was China, I wouldn't want to get into any sort of conflict with US.
And how would you have thought, Osama, if you were India, not China? How would you have seen this development? One of your strongest allies and trade partners, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and a country that you're strategically so strongly integrated with, namely Iran, joining hands in presence of a country that you had military skirmishes with, namely China.
Yeah, India should be concerned, and India might at some point feel, if this deal goes on, if this deal cements, India at some point might feel being encircled. being contained. However, at the same time, you see that India and China both have been the biggest beneficiaries of what's happening in the international energy market. Especially, India has become a huge, a largest. India has gained a lot of money and a lot of clout recently by providing fuel oil and oil products to none other than the United States of America. So India is doing well on their own end. However, if this goes on, India at one point might feel being encircled or being contained, and then you can expect a reaction from India. But up right now, I think everyone is just in the wait and see mode. We don't know what's going to happen.
Thank you very much, Osama Rizvi, for being guest in our program. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Osama Rizvi, and you know his line of arguments is mostly driven by the economics, as he is certainly an expert of the subject. But my last guest in the program is one of the most knowledgeable experts on Middle East that I have known so far, and he is Dr. Rashid Wali Janjua, who is joining me from Islamabad on Skype. Dr. Rashid Wali Janjua, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
How do you see the development taking place between Saudi Arabia and Iran? You just heard what the other experts have said before.
This is a very important development that for the first time, China has actually mediated actively between two countries to bring about a rapprochement. And for Saudi Arabia, this is in sync with their new orientation of its leadership towards trade, investments, and connectivity. Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman is completely rebranding itself. And there are initiatives like a completely new city coming up, new investments, new diversification of their economy initiatives are underway. And this was a very clear pointer towards a new orientation, which does not privilege conflicts and geopolitical wranglings as a proxy of global war competition. Rather, they see the future into a peaceful Middle East and fostering the economic linkages. And that's why they wanted to bury the hatchet with Iran. And there were indicators in the shape of Mohammed bin Salman's statements regarding re-engagement with Syria, Yemen war, and the need for a peaceful settlement, and Iran. And you see, since October, there is a ceasefire which is holding in Yemen. And that was after a short ceasefire that was agreed between both countries. But even after the expiry of that deadline, both countries did not resort to any hostilities or violence. And I think that was a consequence of the backdoor efforts of China, which have borne fruit. And Saudi Arabia would benefit tremendously because of this peace dividend that they are actively pursuing. And that would also take the pressure off the Saudi leadership from its retrogressive elements, which have always opposed reforms. So on both counts, it's a win-win formulation for the Saudi leadership.
If I understand you correctly, you find it a superficial engagement. You don't find enough depth in it, and you don't believe it's going to last very long.
Yes, it's not in optics alone. I think there's a lot of substance to this. And we also know that on Iran's part, there is a kind of a conflict weariness, not only in the leadership, but amongst the society. And, you know, Iran has been in the throes of agitation, and those convulsions very clearly point out the desire of the society, which has been, you know, very adversely impacted by the sanctions and resultant impoverishment. There was a palpable sense of conceding by the Iranian leaderships, because we have Raisi, who is apparently in this cast in the same mold like hardline presidents, conservative presidents, but still he has conceded to the demands of the agitators, and some concessions have been given by way of women's apparel, their education. So this was a very clear desire on part of Iran to engage with Saudi Arabia and to bury the hatchet and to find its place in the world community and make use of its resources, which have hitherto lain unutilized because of the sanctions regime. So I see it more than optics, definitely.
Don't you believe, Dr. Rashid, Iran is going to make or should be making a lot of changes in its approach toward certain international affairs if it requires or if it is dreaming KSA to take this initiative very seriously? Because you understand that these nations are engaged against each other on various thematic fronts.
Yeah, we should be cognizant of realities also, because Iran is basically a revolution that deposed a monarchy. Saudi Arabia is actually a monarchy, and there are inbuilt contradictions into their approach to the governance, approach to the politics, and those cleavages and schisms could be exploited by anyone in future. But I think if there are broad, agreements on engagement and not to stoke the fires of conflict and through their proxies in countries like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen especially. So this would be, I think, one of the most important dividends. But Iran definitely would need to moderate its policies. It would need to display a more coherent and consistent approach, because the proxy warfare and its ideology of exporting the revolution, because the best way to defend revolution as per them is to continually expand the revolution. So that ideology needs to be moderated in sync with the global realities if they want to engage peacefully on a permanent basis. And for that, the JCPOA agreement is very important. So the sooner they clinch an agreement and bring United States back on the fold, which has serious reservations about Iran's Middle East policy and its missile program. And those were the two sticking points on which the JCPOA agreement founded on the rocks of mutual suspicions. So I think these are some of the angularities that need to be smoothened before we can be overly optimistic about the sustainability of this process.
Dr. Rashid, is the initiative taken by Iran is purely rooted into the economy? Is it an economic driven initiative, or do you find something beyond economics that has brought such a change and softness in Iran's approach toward one of its arch rivals?
You see, economic reasons are quite understandable because of the linkages with Chinese economy now, because China is a economic powerhouse. It has a trade volume of around 15 billion US dollars with Iran, which has tremendous potential to increase considering the mineral resources, energy resources of Iran and China both. Saudi Arabia also has a trade volume of around 89 billion with China, and China is leveraging that economic advantage fully to translate it into a cloud to bring these countries together so that the dividends of peace are fully reaped by countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China, and it should be a win-win formulation for all. But I also see a desire on part of Iran to break free from this perpetual geopolitical wrangling mode, and which is enervating its economy, which is acting as a continual drain, because geopolitics of confrontation have not served Iranian government as well as society well.
And Dr. Rashid, how about China's demonstration of its soft power? Talking business with countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran and bringing them together without firing a single bullet. Isn't it a huge triumph for China's doctrine of soft power without using any of its hard influences.
That's true because this policy is in sync with Xi Jinping's policy of Global Security Initiative and Global Development Initiative. We know there are two competing overarching policies at play. One is based upon economic unions, trade, investment, and another is by interlocking security alliances. And we know both manifestations, the US-led alliances and the Chinese-led alliances, they have a different flavor altogether. Now you see Quad, AUKUS, and NATO, and compare it with something like Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, BRI, and now there are other engagements with the rest of the littoral countries of Indian and Pacific countries. So China is following a different model, staying away from militarization of this interaction, whereas the United States is perhaps still locked into those security alliances. And that is why Xi Jinping came up with a global security initiative, and its credo, it was explained in its text, was that the peace leads to stability, and stability leads to prosperity. And it is the right of every nation to reap the benefits of sustainable peace. And sustainable peace is a consequence of removal of the basic causes of the conflicts, for which China would play its part to help those countries, those who are caught up in the fray of these conflicts. And I think this is the first example, and this is the breaking of the glass ceiling. For the first time, Chinese have overcome their inhibition to play a role at the geopolitical level in active mediation between the two countries. And what a fortuitous concatenation of events and desires. Saudi Arabia and Iran both are desirous of a patch-up. And we know that Mohammed bin Salman very clearly.
And Dr. Rashid, lastly, how do you believe India would be thinking or would be taking the situation? Because it's a catch-22 situation for India, which is seeing two of its ally nations joining hand in presence of China, one of the countries it has fought skirmishes, it has been militarily engaged with recently.
I think India is also pursuing a policy wherein there are standoffs on the line of actual control. They had their spat on Galwan, but despite that, they had a trade volume of $90 billion with China in 2019. And from 2019 onwards, you must have witnessed a steep rise in the conflict on the line of actual control between China and India. But despite that, the trade volume has increased. It has now reached $120 billion. So I think India is also cognizant of the reality of China, and it will not view this thaw between Saudi Arabia and Iran with trepidation, because India is also locked into Middle Eastern alliances like I2U2, and they are very keen to play their part and be part of an economic arrangement. And the way Indian economy is growing, I think they would like to engage positively with a country like Saudi Arabia, which has a lot of clout in GCC countries. And I don't think so India would try and derail this process, because they are also pursuing a very deft policy in which they are engaging with China. At the same time, they are playing their role as a regional surrogate as a US ally in the containment policy of China. So that dilemma has to be resolved by India in future. And if they want to be part of this new global security initiative, which leads to peace and prosperity, I think it will redound to their advantages, and they should see the light of reason.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rashid Wali Zinjua, for being guest in our program.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the crisis is deep rooted. Both the nations have taken this excellent initiative to come forward despite all odds, despite the thousands of years of animosity and a history that does not bring them together. It is not only a great initiative by Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that is also reviving its relationship with the countries like Qatar and Turkey, but also with a country like Iran. It's turn for Iran to decide whether it is going to take this seriously or will this remain to be a superficial engagement between the two sides. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.